welcome everybody. We want to thank the organizing group in Breakbulk America for considering having offshore wind as one of the panel discussions. And of course, at a Breakbulk conference, everybody must be wondering, why do we need to talk about offshore wind? Well, the interesting thing about offshore wind is the components and materials involved in the industry are all these big, ugly pieces of equipment, high and heavy, out of gauge, overweight, etc. So it fits right into the whole breakbulk concept of how you do your business and the things you focus on. So the way to address this year is focusing on the supply chain. We have some interesting panelists representing both design and commissioning of heavy equipment, ports and terminals, and in logistics and infrastructure, supply chain services. So the view on the offshore wind industry, it's a transformational opportunity possibly for the United States for the next 25 to 30 years. So it's an area that should be of interest to everybody here. So I'd just like to introduce the panelists, and I'll give them an opportunity to introduce themselves. To my left, we have Alberto Morandi from Gusto MSC, Russell Williams, Director of TradePoint Atlantic, and Stig Kierkegaard, heavy client representative for AP Moller Maersk. So, Alberto?
Well, I thank Breakbulk America for the opportunity to speak. I'm with Gusto MSC. We are part of NOV. And we're basically an engineering design company, and we've been pioneers in the offshore business from the first jackup designed and built in Europe, the Seashell, in 1959, to the first dynamically positioned drill ship that was operating in West Africa in 1972. And when I see this slide, I always like to remember President Bush when he started Zapata drilling in 1953. Not a single of those technologies even existed. And in the space of 20 years, we invented the jackup, the semi-submersible, the drill ship, all the offshore technologies we have today. And offshore wind is going through that transformative initial stage. I mean, we at Gusto MSC started off with our first modern unit in 2003, so we've been about 20 years there. We have about 40 units that we designed doing all kinds of offshore wind installations. I'm a naval architect. I'm the general manager of Gusto MSC based here in Houston. And so my background is really engineering, technology, and design. This just gives you an idea of the different solutions there for offshore wind installation. The most popular one being the wind turbine installation vessel. That's a jackup that can, with cranes up to between 2,200 and 2,500 tons, which can do, the entire installation in one set. And these are units that, can lift the heaviest turbines. They are designed to move 150 times per year, which then brings the economic side. I mean, if you really, they aim to install a turbine set per day, or even if it's 2 days, you're looking at day rates, let's say $250,000 a day. You look at only adding $500,000 as the marginal added cost to the turbine because of the installation. Number two, on the other side, is how it started in the US at the Block Island, when they use these lift boats, which are shallow draft vessels with limited capability, low capital investment because those already existed, but it turned out to be a very expensive solution because of a lot of downtime. So since then, there's a whole number of different attempts to, because of the Jones Act, you can only bring a foreign vessel with a large crane to stay on the field installing. You cannot call into port. So there are a host of feedering solutions. We offer the one with a jackup, proper jackup as feeder, as well as we support, barges moored alongside, and we all kinds of motion compensation. We also have been working with Half-Run on a docked solution where the feeder unit docks into the jackup, and then a motion compensated vessel. And just yesterday, we launched a new solution in Hamburg where you have this retractable boom that can latch into the wind tower. So you now have 2 fixed points, nothing moving. And this boom has a trolley that can lift and rotate the turbine to be installed. So what we're trying to do now is to actually reduce the size of the jackup and the capital investment by not having a crane in the first place. The only crane is a small crane. That's actually the NOV Trident crane. Is an electrical crane, so low carbon footprint that can be remotely operated. And it's just there to lift the blade into the tool. So again, a lot of development and a lot of solutions happening in that space. Right now we are supporting the construction of 9 different large wind turbine installation vessels, and you can see as you progress to the newer ones that the vessels get larger and larger. So we're supporting Penta-Ocean in Japan and Shimizu, Seaway 7, and then Eneti and Cadeler. The Dominion vessel is the first Jones Act compliant wind turbine installation vessel that will work for Dominion Energy. And well, basically that project won an OTC Best Paper Award for the role that this jackup is having on the supply chain for offshore wind in the US.
Okay, Alberto, thank you. Russ? Sure. Pass the...
My name is Russell Williams. I'm Director of Business Development with TradePoint Atlantic, very much focused on the offshore wind business, among other cargoes that we're moving through the facility. TradePoint is a 3,300 acre facility located just outside of Baltimore, Maryland, on the US East Coast. We are the site of a former steel mill, Bethlehem Steel at Sparrows Point. We have demolished 17 million square feet of steelmaking structures there and are redeveloping the site into a modern multimodal logistics hub. And as part of that, we are owners and operators of the stevedoring and terminal services business at the site, as well as short line railroad that interchanges with both NS and CSX. And then we develop the facility itself. So we've constructed, on the order of about 13.5 million square feet of new structures, mostly Class A industrial type tenants. This is just a quick snapshot of some of the companies that we have on site today, and you can see the different industries that they play in and how we have overlaps from manufacturing perspective, general business, e-commerce, and distribution. And then what we'll talk about mostly today on the offshore wind side, you'll see US Wind and Ørsted there, 2 developers in the offshore wind space that have facilities at TradePoint. This is just a quick snapshot of what we're doing. So industrial development, lots of 1 to 2 million square foot warehouses, and then of course purpose-built structures that will go towards the offshore wind industry. As I mentioned, I think the Shoreline Railroad is very relevant to this conversation from a raw material perspective coming in. One of the things that I'll talk about a little bit more is manufacturing of offshore wind components within the United States and access to materials from that perspective. And then on our vessel stevedoring side, TradePoint Terminals is our entity that performs all of those operations at the facility. So we do stevedoring of dry bulk, break bulk, project cargo, and we'll be getting into the offshore wind space as that takes off on the US East Coast. So what we're here to talk about today is obviously offshore wind. Here's a master plan on the right-hand side of the image that you can see. So we have 2 shaded areas that are carved out for offshore wind right now, with another couple hundred acres that can be added in addition to what's shown there now. So a very, very significant footprint to execute at scale for these types of projects that require a very large footprint to be able to marshal an entire campaign's worth of components with access to deep water berths, rail access, of course, truck access runs right through the facility, and a willing and able workforce to go execute on that. Well, I think that's the end.
Just wing it.
Seems stuck. That was my last slide.
Finished?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Russ. Stig?
Yeah, so hello everyone. I don't have a presentation, so I'll do it directly from the hip, more or less. My name is Stig Kierkegaard. I'm working for Maersk. I'm based in Denmark, and amongst other things, I'm responsible for the segment renewables in Maersk. You all know Maersk, I guess, to some degree. Pretty known brand. What we do is to do integrated logistics globally. So that's everything from wind turbines to small packages in e-commerce. And I think the development that we have been in for the last 5 years of our integrated journey has really proved to be a really important new strategy for Maersk. You can't call it new anymore, right? But it's a good strategy for Maersk. Let's say it like that. The reality is where we are today is we're deciding that we're moving into the renewables segment quite heavily. We are super interested in what this segment can offer to us and what we can offer to that segment over time. And what is really key for us in terms of how that is to actually what kind of value can you bring to the customers? Where do we fit into the value chain, and how can we actually develop this segment to become even better than it is today from a logistics point of view and a supply chain point of view? Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. So I just thought I'd give you a little context as to where we are with offshore wind. As you might know, the current administration committed to develop 30 gigawatts of offshore wind energy by 2030. It's an extremely large undertaking, which our panelists are going to define to you a little bit better. But part of that commitment included a guarantee to produce anywhere from 80 to 100,000 jobs, to produce clean energy for up to about 20 million homes, reduce CO2 emissions by 80 metric tons a year, inspire $12 billion of capital investment on an annual basis, make commitments to ports and terminals of $800 million, and then, of course, provide alternate energy sources to the consumer, which is very important. So this is where the administration focus, where everybody here should be interested on, but we have some other things to consider. What's going on at the same time is a global explosion for renewables and offshore wind. And that's, a lot of factors are driving that. Obviously, the cost of fossil fuels has made everybody accelerate their interest in renewable energy. But at the same time, macroeconomics and geopolitical events have created some questions as far as how development might proceed. And of course, everybody can relate to the commodity prices and the uncertainty of the supply chain, and that's kind of thwarted the development a little bit, and that's kind of lead into what we'd kind of like to talk about as panelists today. So last year, the Breakbulk America conference focused on the Jones Act. We're not going to talk about that much. We might make a few references to it. That's a whole subject matter. You need some good lawyers for that, and I'm not one of those, so you might want to save that discussion for them. We're going to focus on the supply chain issues. So really the first question that I have for the team here is, with the explosion and the globalization of offshore wind, do we have the supply chain capabilities to address the requirements in offshore wind? So Alberto, since you are involved in projects across the entire globe, why don't you start out? And Russ and Stig, if you guys have any comments, jump in anytime. So,
I mean, we have to also realize that a lot of these are based on pledges and targets that government have. To turn those into real contracts that spur investment, that is a different thing. So I think if we are going to materialize those pledges, no, we need a lot more vessels, a lot more turbines, a lot more cable. But we still feel on the ground that it's just difficult to see these things materialize. I always say you have to align supply chain, projects, and finance. Projects don't exist without supply chain, but the supply chain does not exist without project. And finance is not going to show up unless you can align the project with the supply. We saw in the oil business, when the downturn came, there's still about 70 drilling rigs that were built 5 years ago and never left the shipyard because the owner walked away with the downturn. So investors are very peculiar. They want to see that there is a real project, that they're not going to build something that's going to get stuck in the middle and left behind. So there's definitely a disconnect between all the targets and pledges and the reality on the supply chain. That's my view.
I think that's well said. I do think that I agree with you. It's a lot of it comes down to timing and what actually gets through the permitting process and into construction versus what is a target or a goal right now. I do think I agree if we do convert on most, if not all, of the targeted projects at this point, especially considering the amount of construction going on in Asia and Europe right now, where you have more robust supply chains that are going to largely be committed to fulfilling projects there. We are certainly going to need to build out not just manufacturing, but training, and a vessel fleet that can handle the offshore wind pipeline in the United States.
And ports are huge,
And
right?
ports,
And a
yeah.
lot of investment that you need to have.
Absolutely, and
Destination for-
longer term investment. None of those things are quick, right? So when we talk about that and the timing of projects coming along, a lot of people talk about 2030 being a big marker, for the United States to have a certain amount of megawatts of installed capacity. It's not really that long, not far away from now when you start to talk about the different investments that need to be made to be able to bring that to fruition.
Yeah. So I think if you look at the last 2 years, the supply chains are super vulnerable, as I see it, and not only for the large components, but also for the small components. So there is a lot of investment that has to be done in this in order to really move forward. If you look at the large components specifically for the offshore part, today you have in Europe maybe 5 ports that are really able to handle it. In the US, you probably have like maybe the same, maybe even less, that can actually handle this type of equipment. So it will require a significant investment to really start to move in the right direction and to really start to accelerate on this. And then the other part of it is all of the OEMs are really not making money at the moment, right? They're not really seeing the orders coming in as well. So you will have a pile-up effect at some point in time where you end up coming into a potential challenge actually with a bottleneck.
Great. So you guys just brought up a good point. So project alignment and financing are 2 items that are of major concern. So you have it on both the developer and the service provider side. So there's 2 things that come to mind when you guys mention that to me. It's the certainty of the projects and then the duration of the projects. Can you guys comment at all about any of that?
Well, I mean, I think at least from an installation perspective, usually this is a 1 year. These are 1 year projects. I mean, here the Dominion, this construction in Brownsville of the First Jones Act is really paid by a developer, which is Dominion, but they have a sequence of projects. They'll keep the vessel engaged for at least 5 years, and they have a relatively friendly agreement with the state of Virginia, where if things go over, they can actually pass to the consumer, which is in the end of the day is the final step, right? If you lock the developer into a PPA, he has to lock everybody else, right? So, and it's not easy to align 5 different projects. I mean, we've been trying to do that in oil and gas forever and not succeeding, so.
I think the other part to that I would add is the permitting process is so critical in that. So going through the BOEM permitting process, is by its nature, it's a lengthy process. There's a lot of key stakeholders involved, as there should be. And so to get through that from getting a lease area to final investment decision and going to construction is a long timeline. So like you're saying, there's a lot of things that need to be lined up and stay in alignment over that time period. It's not just the different stakeholders, but it's material pricing, it's supply chain disruptions. So I think that as BOEM steadily moves through more and more iterations of that, and kind of that all comes together, I think it's that process kind of smooths out that'll help things.
Yeah, I actually don't have anything to add to that. I really think it's well said by the gentleman.
So I want to tie back in because I'm not sure if you guys addressed one part of that. Obviously, if you're a financier, you look for cash flow and secure extended timeline for an investment. The duration of existing contracts or potential contracts today, can you guys talk anything about that so again we get a better feel? Because you have a construction phase and then an operation and maintenance phase. So I'm just curious if you guys have any experience on the finance side and the duration of the contracts that are being let and awarded to the different vendors and suppliers.
Well, what I could say is, there's a sharp difference in business model between oil and gas that are no more and offshore wind. Oil and gas has huge upsides. We always say that $100 a barrel covers a lot of sins. The offshore wind business is more predictable, but also at a lower return of investment. So and also there's a lot of repetition. You're installing 100 turbines on the field, so a mistake in one is a mistake in 100. So, this tighter margins, I think, are something that it's not that easy to deal with.
Russ, got any comments?
It's a multi-year process, and obviously it's very variable, but multi-year process to get construction completed, and then the wind farm is going to be in operation for 20 plus years. So it's a long term from that perspective, but there is quite a gap between making that decision and then getting blades spinning in the water. So, and certainly investment that needs to be made in advance to get to that point.
So what we actually see from a logistics point of view and a supply chain point of view is actually that the contracts become much longer. They become more like frameworks instead of project contracts, like it's been a lot in the past. And that basically ties up for the whole investment setup and so on. So I think that will slowly change, because the investment that we and others have to do is so significant that we would require longer term contracts, and not only for one specific project.
Yeah, and maybe another component that ties into the investment is that based on oil prices now, the prediction within these 2 years, the oil and gas industry is going to produce about $1.5 trillion of free cash flow. And no doubt some of that money is going to be used to buy into wind assets, but also a lot of it's going to be used to use the supply chain. Those oil and gas companies are going to need vessels and logistics and shipping, and it's difficult to compete with the money they can pay. So there's going to be also an influence there.
So we have this burgeoning industry that's going to grow over the next 25 to 30 years. And we have a major challenge because the industry is just evolving here in the U.S. So something that comes to mind is workforce development and availability of the workforce. So when you think about shifts maybe in the work culture, approach to work, and the availability of skilled workmen, et cetera, how do you see that playing out in the U.S. offshore wind space? Maybe, Russ, you want to start with that, since you guys are in the labor force business anyway. So
Absolutely, yeah. So just to take some real life examples of what's going on the U.S. East Coast now, with a few facilities for manufacturing being built out. I'll start kind of on the land side. There's very, very skilled welding that needs to be done for monopiles and other foundational structures that go into offshore wind. A lot of very skilled technology-focused jobs that overall unemployment pretty low right now. Kind of hard to find people. So it's going to be a workforce that we need to build, and we're going to need to do it collaboratively and collectively. So I think that it's going to rely a lot on taking kind of expertise from Europe, who's been doing it for a long time, but building the workforce here, engaging early and with apprenticeship programs and similar types of early engagement to get people in the pipeline and build that workforce ourselves.
Yeah. So I think everyone has troubles getting people right now, right? So it's I think it's something that will continue, but I also think there is a huge dependency on a lot of other countries and the supply chain with Asia and Europe as well. And with the local content rules that is specifically for US, it will require really, I think it's going to take a long time actually to get there. It's not just something you do, and these factories, they normally take 3 to 5 years to build really at the port.
Mm-hmm.
So Stig, you brought up something maybe for the audience here. Can you talk a little bit about local content and what that might mean and how it'll affect the industry?
Yeah, so most countries around the world actually have some kind of a local content rule when it comes to turbines, that a certain percentage of the turbines have to be produced locally. What the OEMs do generally is that they take the larger components and produce locally, because that's a pretty big percentage of the turbine. And with that, they meet the requirements. But the reality is it becomes a little bit more complicated, because some governments have very specific rules on what has to be local content and what cannot be local content. And that basically, I think it becomes a bit of a challenge to really manage that from the OEMs. But most of them, they actually open factories in US and Latin America and so on to meet these requirements.
I'll add on to that a little bit. Just on the East Coast specifically, state by state, there are different local requirements that go into the the awards that they're giving out. So it even makes it a little bit more complex, because you'll have certain incentives to locate businesses in certain states versus others, relating to the size projects or number of projects that are going to feed into that state. So certainly something that helps grow and drive that local supply chain, but is something that we need to just also kind of be considered as part of the build out.
And on the maritime side is a lot tighter because of the Jones Act. So every vessel calling to a U.S. port has to be U.S. built owned by U.S. citizens and crewed by U.S. citizens. And there's legislation in Congress to require that of all vessels working in offshore wind to be crewed by U.S. citizens and unionized crews. So that shrinks the availability of particularly experienced crew. And this is, the experience here is not going for a week of training. It's years and years of being at sea and understanding the offshore environment and particularly the safety consequences. Working offshore requires a lot of experience.
So Russ, just talking about training for a second. Are you familiar with, or what's TradePoint's plan as far as training and development of the local workforce?
Yeah, so a lot of it's engaging with other third parties. So I use the example of MyTags, which is a maritime institute just on the other side of the harbor in Baltimore. They're unrolling offshore wind training programs. There's a couple welding schools or technician schools in Maryland that are part of other organizations that are looking to target specifically the type of welding skills needed for some of the larger component manufacturing in offshore wind. So it's really looking component by component what needs to go into that, just speaking from a manufacturing perspective, but what needs to be done for that, and then targeting programs and just rolling your sleeves up and looking at who can provide that on a local basis, because that's what we're going to need. It's not just going to be one location in the U.S. that makes a component. There's going to be multiple, so you're going to need it up and down the East Coast. And then on the stevedoring and terminal operations side, same thing. It's heavy lift. A lot of those companies are here today, but it's a different type of component to be moved on the East Coast that hasn't been done, before. So it'll be bringing people in and training up, the local workforce that has a lot of skill, but maybe needs to be pivoted towards that specific type of operation.
Do you see the developers and the OEMs having special requirements for the staffs that'll support their activities?
I do. Yeah, and I think a lot of it is driven by, first and foremost by the manufacturers, but then kind of your tier one suppliers certainly are going to be driving a lot of that.
So we were talking earlier about some challenges facing the industry, and geopolitical issues come into play. You guys actually made some references to it, and I was just curious. I think we have geopolitical as two separate items, but certainly there's international concerns and then there's domestic concerns, and I'm just curious if you guys can comment on those a little bit.
Well, I was having a chat with Stig before we started, because Denmark is one of the nations that did the most in transitioning to renewable energy, and Stig was saying, we wish we had done more. So I think this whole situation has been a wake-up call on energy security, and and where offshore wind is very important. Nobody can take your wind away, right? And so I think that is one thing that will change people's minds. And of course, the impact on supply chain is very, it's not just that, it's the whole change. And, I was young in the 90s when we talked about the Washington Consensus, which was free market, globalization, and democracy. That culture raised millions of people out of poverty and afforded us a huge, standards of living. They are almost at zero inflation. And then we have this culture that is against globalization now. And now we're starting to see the results of it, because you disrupt the global supply chains, it's going to cost. It's great to build things in the US, but it costs triple. That's simple as that.
I'll speak a little bit just to the domestic side of things, and going back to the local content requirements. Those can vary state by state, and so BOEM is leasing the areas, but then the offtake agreements and the projects themselves more come under kind of a state by state purview in some ways. So I think collaboration and coordination is really key in that. There's ways that we can kind of maximize the efficiency of the supply chain and make it a little bit less splintered. If there's some collaboration and coordination when it comes to local content requirements and what can fulfill that from supplying a project in one state with components versus having to stay all in state.
Yeah, so from my side, I think that's the beauty of our business, right? The supply chain and transport, all of these requirements and the geopolitical thing that is happening is just making it more challenging, and we just need to adapt to that. I think the reality of what we are looking into in terms of all of this is that all of the gigawatts that they want to put out, right, in all of the governments, it's super ambitious, which is super good, but it's probably also too ambitious in the very short timeline that we have, right? And that is, I think, the biggest challenge we have, honestly, with the geopolitical part.
So for you guys as suppliers in the supply chain, how do you see state and federal elections and political changes affecting or potentially affecting the offshore wind market? Nobody wants to comment about politics. I guess that's the wrong thing. Don't
No,
talk
but-
about sex, politics, and money, right? Isn't that the old story? But
What I would go back is to 1940s and 50s when offshore oil and gas started in the Gulf of Mexico. Back then, there wasn't even a definition where that belong. Is that federal? Is that state? And it took years of legal battle to establish what we have today. And the technologies were not there, so it's no different. I mean, this is going to take time to sort out. And
well, I think part of the question is, I'm not making political statements here, so don't overreact. Prior administration against renewables and offshore wind. Current administration in favor, because the administrations are determined by political decision, right? Elections. So what happens if we have a change? How do you guys see? If I'm an investor as in a service provider and I'm going to develop infrastructure or a port or design a new piece of equipment, what happens if things change? How do you see that risk as a service provider?
I mean, it's a risk. I think it comes down to the time to act is now. Obviously, there's a lot of momentum behind it. A lot of funding out there, port infrastructure development grants, and the like. There's a lot of opportunity, and so now is the time to act. Not to wait.
Yeah, it is a risk, but I think no matter changes, there will still be new projects coming up, and then it's just in other countries and so on. So I see it more shifting to other locations and other things, and not necessarily being a risk of a downfall necessarily.
yeah, I mean, in the end, business is business, dollars are dollars. If we miss out on those business opportunities here, someone else is going to take them. And people here are going to see that and they're going to ask, okay, hang on a minute, why am I not benefiting from this business?
So maybe I should take a negative and flip it into a positive here and talk about all of the federal and state funding opportunities, tax incentives, grants, Title 11 guarantees, et cetera. Maybe you guys can comment a little bit about that, those types of, PDIP, et cetera, that might have affected different areas of services of you guys. But Russ, you wouldn't be able to speak directly, I think, about port development.
Absolutely, yeah. So from a port development standpoint, just as an example, TradePoint has benefited from port infrastructure development grants and the similar, former iterations of those. And it's really about building out, new structures that can bring new industry and new volume into the United States and create economic growth. And so there's a lot of opportunity out there now. There's pretty robust funding buckets under the current administration for those types of projects, port infrastructure development grant in particular, but also the Inflation Reduction Act. It made some changes or modifications, I would say, to investment tax credits, production tax credits that can be taken by offshore wind companies. There's new incentives for manufacturing under that. But that also comes with, some prevailing wage requirements, certain domestic content, other things to help incentivize and build, the domestic supply chain. So there's a lot of opportunities to invest and grow that are being furthered by available monies through those grants.
Stig, how about on the logistics and infrastructure side? Do you see any of the government funding programs or incentive programs that are out there that could help enhance the segment that you focus on?
Yeah, I don't think they will benefit us directly as such. I think we stand on our own as an industry to invest in this. But I have to say I see plenty of opportunities actually to do some really good business in that area and very few limitations actually if the companies are really behind it.
Good. Alberto, anything? Any other comments on that subject? Or
I mean, yeah, the opportunity is there. I think, as I said, that there are risks, but the opportunity always triggers entrepreneurs to step in and do it. So we will see that.
When you talk about the political risk that I raised before, the fact that the federal and state governments have made such large commitments to help develop, infrastructure and so forth, I think it's a good indicator as an investor that it's worth taking a risk, at least to a certain point anyway.
And the government is also supporting a lot of technology development, which I think is, in the end of the day, the answers are technology.
Absolutely, yeah. So any other general comments from you guys? Or?
One other thing to that, just from a port's perspective, the investments in infrastructure that are made for offshore wind certainly provide benefits to other cargo types as well, right? So it's not that it's only focused on one thing. There's a broader, benefit here and a broader economic opportunity for the United States to rehab and upgrade and bring forward some of our, infrastructure that's not maybe partially focused on offshore wind, or maybe it will be focused on that for a time, but there's certainly a broader benefit to that that we can see as a country.
Okay. So I think if we go back from looking into the industry, the developers and the OEMs, they have like 6 major concerns, and those concerns, maybe I'm missing something, they're like permitting, the Jones Act, supply chain, workforce development, safety and security. So I think we pretty much addressed those. Anyway, we're pretty much done. Anybody questions for the panelists here? These guys are all experts in their respective areas. So we're open for questions. They must have done a great job because there isn't any. So that's really good, So that's it for us. Thank you very much.